Now, this is something that we're all aware of, the stereotype of the leafy, affluent south, which is often a long way from reality. Areas of deprivation which exist here just as much as they do in the north of the country. But governments, whether they call it levelling up or not, often seem to ignore that there's also a kind of south-south divide as well, and channel funds away from this region. And that was the message that the group Business South was taking to MPs this week. How deprived an area is gets determined by a range of measures: income, employment, education, health, crime, barriers to housing and services, and living environment. No one's saying that the south as a whole is a deprived area. Less than a fifth of neighbourhoods in the central south part of the region are in the most deprived categories. But that disguises the fact that there are several neighbourhoods in Southampton, Portsmouth and Havant, for example, which rank amongst the most deprived 1% across the whole country. And they're often right next door to far more affluent neighbourhoods, especially in our urban areas.
We don't want to refer to it as a divide because we want the more affluent areas to leverage support for the areas of deprivation, but we need to have a voice in regards to our region on a national stage because it's all relative.
So Vicky, the argument there, actually, first of all, I should say all three of you represent constituencies where this applies, where there's deprivation next to areas of relative wealth. But Vicky, what we're hearing there from Business South is that can benefit the areas which are more deprived. Is that the experience that you see where you live?
I think it's really difficult to ask people from more supposedly affluent areas to be sort of counterbalancing those who are next to them in less affluent areas, because those people are also suffering huge house prices. So, you know, on paper they're not deprived, but actually we need the government to recognise that household income is really the driver of poverty. And in a lot of rural areas, you won't even see this because these areas are really separated, you know, often miles apart, with tiny communities that have really, really deep poverty. And lots of elderly people, certainly in Dorset, the oldest part of the country, where we have really big problems with pensioner poverty. You won't see that on there because a lot of those factors don't apply, because those people aren't working, you know, they perhaps own their own house, they're very, very cash poor, and they are struggling just as much. So it's absolutely right, we look at these deprived areas, but we shouldn't be pitting areas against each other, whether it's north-south or south-south.
Although you say that, but there is a feeling, and I think it's borne out, that the north has benefited from funding. I mean, from Portsmouth, and the Isle of Wight, they both get thrown in as part of Hampshire, yet in many ways, Portsmouth is very different from Hampshire.
So before we came into government, there was a real lack of fair funding across our local authorities, and we've made a big change to that. So that has meant, and if I take my city, for example, that's meant that we've had more money for just things like potholes, but also for impact funding, so for our high streets, but also really proudly for Pride in Place. So we're able to look at how on earth are we making sure that there is more equality across Hampshire, and so that those areas that do have more deprivation or have been neglected and ignored for many years, and I believe that's my city has been exactly that we are able to allow them to thrive and to bring in money and to bring in business. It's happened across, if we look at Manchester and we look at Yorkshire, where Tracy Brabourne is the mayor, they're very similar to Hampshire. They've got a Bradford and a Leeds, like we've got a Portsmouth and Southampton, and she's managed to really bring funding and money in across the area so that everyone is gaining. So there's good transport links, there's good education, and we need to be able to do that. And the Isle of Wight, another case in point, where there is wealth, but there's lots and lots of problems there. And in the study that we're talking about, it has some of the most deprived neighbourhoods in the whole country. When your party was in power, did the whole levelling up agenda, did that irritate you? And what did you do to try and get funds to the south and to the area where you live?
Yeah, I mean, the Isle of Wight's always suffered with this idea of, oh, it's in the south or the southeast, therefore it must be wealthy. And of course we're not. We have some of the toughest challenges anywhere in the country, not least of all the geography, but also we have an older age demographic. So social care crisis across the UK is particularly acute on the Isle of Wight. Look, I think Amanda and I are probably not going to agree on funding formulas, because what we found on the Isle of Wight is since the government came in, they've adjusted the funding formulas for local government. And actually, our council has had a cut to its funding that amounts to a 50 million deficit over 3 years. And that includes a cut to the council's ability to provide social care and provide children's services. my argument would be because a Labour government thinks that we're from the south, we're wealthy, we're rural. And there is a big contested argument about how governments interpret and use statistics. So at least we can probably agree that governments do have to make political decisions about what data they use, how they interpret it, and what they think is the most important thing.
But there is a rurality thing. I mean, we've got a problem with our Dorset and Wiltshire Fire and Rescue, which is one of the worst funded in the country because it is primarily rural. Our fire service, our police service, our schools, our councils are some of the worst funded because they've shifted the funding formula. And of course, people who are deprived need to have that floor of funding. But actually, if you're moving it from one place to another, you run the risk of creating problems in other areas. So in Bournemouth and Poole, there have been some really good pieces of pride in place that have gone to very deprived areas. But actually, that money's been taken from the same council, so it's coming out from the pockets of every other home.
Pride in Place money is additional funding.
It may well be.
As is impact funding. So the £20 million is additional funding.
OK, but what you probably won't know is in BCP, £60 million of funding has been taken out over the same 5-year period as 3 lots of 20 million has gone in to 3 deprived areas. So I absolutely accept that's new funding for those areas. But how do you feel if you live just outside of that area when you and everybody else and the people inside that area have lost £60 million of funding at the same time?
So we should just explain what Pride in Place is. It's funding that's been given to 244 neighbourhoods across the country. £20 million to be able to spend in a way that they deem is best for that area.
There's a neighbourhood board, so there's a chair and a neighbourhood board. And obviously, the whole part of it is like, these are areas that have had things done to them that haven't worked, and there still has been deprivation, and this is about what local people want to improve their areas, to have pride in their area. And actually, £20 million, the whole idea is leveraging that, so getting partnerships in. My love would be to be able to expand that across other parts of the city, to show what you can do with growth, with business. Some of the things they've done, like I've said, in places like Yorkshire, in Manchester, because we have deprived areas in the south as well.
And of those Pride of Place, only 20 of the 244 are in the south. Does that sound about right, Joe, or do you think, again, the south has been ignored for this funding?
There's a lot in Hampshire.
I think it has. Look, we've got a Pride in Place area on the Isle of Wight Ride, but the commitment to Ride, it was set up under the last Conservative government. It's been continued by this one.
With funding.
But even then, there are towns on the Isle of Wight that simply won't benefit. So Sandown, I think, is somewhere that could really do with particular funding. It won't benefit from that. So look, the Pride in Place is very welcome for the towns that have got it, but there's an awful lot of areas, an awful lot of towns that simply not going to benefit at all.
And I think it comes to your Hampshire thing as well, being in the south. There's quite a few of those have been awarded in Hampshire, showing that actually outside of Hampshire people feel it's that very leafy suburb, but actually internally there are some really deprived areas that have been neglected.
OK, interesting stuff. Thank you all.